Hey everybody, Mr. Hart here. Just two chapters left here on Okay for Now. I'm going to kind of get right into this one because I'm not going to lie to you guys, this chapter is a long one and quite a bit happens, so let's get into it. Chapter 9, The Great Eskimo Corlu, plate 237. It took a while, but by my first Saturday of May, spring finally decided to stick around. Mr. Loeffler said it was the latest spring he'd ever seen. But that probably meant it would be the warmest, and he was right. I didn't even need my flight jacket anymore, which didn't mean I was going to stop wearing it anytime soon. By that first Saturday, everything had jumped from brown to green, and if you stood in front of the Marysville Free Public Library and looked at the maples up and down the street, you could watch their gold leaves unfurl like little flags waving from all that they were worth, which after a long winter was a lot. I pulled the Saturday deliveries past people dragging last year's leaves from their bushes, cutting back edges, digging up gardens by the curbs, and raking. Marysville garden inspector was going to stop by in the afternoon. It was like that kind of day. And back at Spicer's Deli, I told Lil that everything looked as green as New Zealand, and she said, "How would you know?" Which I think meant that I didn't exactly do half the work I was supposed to do on Mr. Barber's New Zealand project. You know, and the one that we handed in together and shared one grade. But I'm no chump. "I'll buy you a Coke and show you how green it is," I said. "Does that mean I'm supposed to go get 2 Cokes for the two of us?" I shook my head. I took 2 quarters out of my pocket and I laid them on the deli counter. Lil chinged opened the register and slid them into the drawer, and I went over to the fridge and I brought back 2 bottles of Coke. I took off their caps. I brought them up front. There was a froth on the top of the bottles, and Lil could hardly keep from giggling when she took her first sip. "Ooh, it always goes up my nose," she said. Gosh, she was beautiful. She walked with me to Mrs. Windermere's, and I'm not lying, everything was even greener than it had been in town when I was making deliveries earlier that morning. And it was greener by a lot, too. The maples, the oaks, the grass, the ferns coming up beside the road and the fields. Especially those fields. They even smelled green. "You were right," said Lil. And she took my hand and we walked up to Mrs. Windermere's. Slowly. It was still too short. At the house, there was this car I'd never seen before, and a block and a half long. It was so long that it didn't fit in the turnaround. Half of it was on the grass, gleaming everywhere. And we went to the back, and I unlocked the door with that secret key, and Lil and I brought the groceries in, and I put them all away. And we started out because we saw the whole slow walk back. We still had our slow walk back to look forward to. And then Mrs. Windermere came in, and Mr. I Own the Gleaming Car was next to her. "Skinny delivery boy," she said. "Mrs. Windermere, do you think that maybe you could call me something else by now?" "No. Is everything put away already?" "Yep, we were just going," Lil said as I reached for her hand. "And this is?" "Lillian Spicer," said Lil. "It's nice to meet you, Lillian." "Thank you. It's very nice to meet you, too." She always was so polite. "Did I tell you that she has green eyes? Did I tell you that she's beautiful?" "So is Lillian your girlfriend?" said Mrs. Windermere. At that moment, everything stopped. And I mean everything stopped. "Skinny delivery boy, you know I've never beat around the bush. Is it a yes or is it a no?" I looked at Lil, and she looked at me. She wasn't planning to be helpful with this, so I looked back at Mrs. Windermere. "Yes," I said. And I looked back at Lil, and at this moment I was smiling, and so was she. "Mrs. Windermere," said Mr. I Own the Gleaming Car, "and this is Mr. Gregory, who is supposed to be producing my play at the end of the month, but who is not taking much headway at all." "Who is making the best headway any producer could possibly make with a writer who is," started Mr. Gregory. "Oh, Mr. Gregory likes strawberry ice cream," said Mrs. Windermere. "I do not like strawberry ice cream," said Mr. Gregory. "Nonsense! Everybody likes strawberry ice cream. What kind did I order today?" "Raspberry sherbet," said Lil. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Windermere, and she shook her head. "That's too bad." "Raspberry sherbet," said Mr. Gregory. And we all sat down to small bowls of raspberry sherbet, except for Mr. Gregory, who had sat down to a bowl of raspberry sherbet about as big as New Zealand because he hadn't had raspberry sherbet since he was a boy, and he thought he would be able to make up for lost time. I think he might be a good guy. At least, he looked like he could be a good guy, but the jury's still out. You can't look like Mr. I own the gleaming car when you're eating a huge bowl of raspberry sherbet in somebody else's kitchen, though. So are all their actors ready for the play? Said Lil. Well, that's the problem. Mr. Gregory hasn't cast them all yet. You have no idea how difficult it is to find actors for as many parts as we need for this script. If only a certain writer had been willing to... A certain writer won't, so you just hush, said Mrs. Windermere. Who all do you still need? Well, I need a Helen Burns to start with, said Mr. Gregory. Helen Burns, said Mrs. Windermere slowly. Yes, just to start with. Mrs. Windermere looked at Lil. Well, there she is right there. It's Skinny Delivery Boy's girlfriend. Mr. Gregory looked at Lil. I'm not an actor. No, you would be an actress. And Lillian, every young girl, once she steps upon a Broadway stage, enjoys the thrill of being an actress. Well, not me. She has the right voice, the right manner, even the right hair. I think she'd be perfect. Yeah, you're right. She would be perfect, said Mr. Gregory. How old are you? I'm 25, said Lil, jokingly. Have you ever acted before? Said Mr. Gregory. Lil stood up. No, and I won't be acting now. At that moment, I chimed in. She's really, really good, I said. Lil looked at me like she was going to throw the rest of her raspberry sherbet right into my face. Really? Lil looked back at Mr. Gregory and she smiled sweetly. Well, sort of. Then she pointed at me. Do you have a part for him, too? Mr. Gregory shook his head. No, not for a young boy. I smiled at Lil sweetly. Well, sort of. Perhaps he could be the voice of Bertha Mason, said Mrs. Windermere. Wait, the voice of Bertha Mason, I said. Can you shriek like an insane woman who's been locked in an attic for many great years? Said Mrs. Windermere. Oh, yes, I've heard Doug shriek lots of times, said Lil. And I looked at her, and she smiled even more sweetly. No, I said. Lil looked at Mr. Gregory and shrugged. Well, if he won't shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for many great years, then I will not be your Helen Burns. Then you're not Helen Burns, I said. Fine, she said. Fine, I said. I sure did wish we had gotten out of that kitchen as soon as we put those deliveries away at this moment. Well, then that's that, said Mrs. Windermere. That's that, I said. I'll see you next week, Skinny Delivery Boy, said Mrs. Windermere. I'll see you next week, I said. Fine, she said. Fine, I said. And Lil and I dropped our bowls and spoons into the sink and we went to the door. Goodbye, Mr. Gregory, Lil said. And that was the mistake. You see, she shouldn't have stopped to say goodbye. It's like one of those horror movies where the person likes to go back and be mauled to death, and they could have, meanwhile, they could have just saved her life if they just taken only one more step. But no, they had to stop and be polite or something. At this moment, I tried to take Lil's hand. I wanted to get out of there. We were almost through the door. Gregory, said Mrs. Windermere loudly, what have you done with that snowy heron I bought for you? I stopped. I've already told you I haven't done a thing with it. I hate birds, and I hate pictures of birds even more. I wonder if we might have a better place for it than rolled up away in your closet. I turned around. Such as, said Mr. Gregory. The snowy heron, I said. Mrs. Windermere knew how to get my interest. Mrs. Windermere turned to me. Yes, she turned back to Mr. Gregory. I wonder if I might make a present of it to someone. The snowy heron, I said again. Audubon snowy heron, that's what you're telling me. Excuse me, Skinny Delivery Boy. Yes, we would like to make a present to someone who, I don't know, maybe helped out with a performance or something. Mrs. Windermere cupped her chin in her hand. Just a thought. I don't know, she said. And I looked at Lil. Helen Burns is such a great part. You'd be perfect, I said. Wait a minute, said Lil. Why don't we all sit down and have another bowl of raspberry sherbet? Then we'll talk, said Mrs. Windermere. You guys remember that snowy heron, right? Trust me, if you saw that snowy heron, if you saw how beautiful that snowy heron was, if you saw how perfect he looked in those Audubon books, then you would be willing to shriek like an insane woman who had been locked in an attic for many great years, too. You would. It took more than a bit of convincing, though, to get Lil to be Helen Burns, which really is a great part, even if she dies. You might wonder how I finally convinced her. See, it happened on a Monday in geography when Mr. Barber announced that we were going to have another one of our team projects for the year. It was going to be the role of transportation in the county's development, and when Barber asked, "Who would you like to do the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States?" Lil raised her hand and said that she would like to do it with me. "Is that okay with you, Douglas?" asked Mr. Barber. Lil looked at me, and she mouthed the words, "Helen Burns." "Terrific," I said. "And you might wonder who is going to have to do almost everything on a project, because one of us has a real part in the Broadway play with real lines, while the other one just has to stand off stage and scream like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years, and that same one of us did diddly on their New Zealand project. And so the one with the real part of the Broadway play figures that the one without a real part of the Broadway play has a lot to make up for." Gosh, I'm starting to feel like a chump. But whenever I feel like a chump, I remember that snowy heron. Ah, guys, if you just saw that snowy heron. When Mr. Barber found out about the Broadway play, he said that since Lil and I were going to be working so hard to put on this play, we only had to turn in a 500-word report on the Transcontinental Railroad. I didn't look at Lil when Mr. Barber said this. She could have been smiling, but I was. And when Mr. McElroy found out about the Broadway play, he wanted to take the whole period talking about the role of actors in world history. But the only actor that any of us could even think of was John Wilkes Booth. "I guess actors aren't so important after all," said Mr. McElroy. "You can't even imagine an actor ever becoming president of the United States, for example." Which this was true. We couldn't. Kind of ironic, guys, when you look at our current president. Just a little aside. Sorry. When Mrs. Verne found out about the Broadway play, she took a whole period off from solving equations with at least 2 unknowns to talk about her own college acting career, which was a whole lot of lines in Greek that she could still recite, which I'm not going to do right here because I don't even know how. And when Miss Cowper found out about that Broadway play, I thought she was going to walk on air right there in front of us. She said that she hadn't heard such good news in a long, long time. We would have to stop in the introductory poetry unit immediately, she said, and move right into modern drama unit so that the whole class could support Lillian and Douglas. Will we please pass forward our poetry anthologies? And I'm not lying, the whole class loved us at that moment. You can only take so much poetry, especially when it's the poetry of Percy B. Shelley, who is still going to get a punch in the face from me someday. I'll tell you what. Just so you guys know, he's been dead for like 200 years. He's actually married to Mary Shelley, who is the author of Frankenstein, if you guys were curious. Okay, so he died about 1830. So he's been dead about 130 years after when Doug was alive doing this book here. When Coach Reed found out about the Broadway play, he smiled and said that he wasn't surprised that we'd be in it. Maybe he's turning into a good guy too. I don't know. And when Mr. Ferris found out about that Broadway play, Clarence didn't stop rocking during that whole lab, which involved sulfur, which is something you really don't want to smell like, but which we all did by the time we were finished. But Mr. Ferris promised we wouldn't smell like that by the time the curtain came up. And let me tell you, when Mr. Powell heard about that Broadway play, he went over to the Birds of America, and he turned the pages, and he came to one called The Great Esquimau Curlew. "Look at this one," he said. "An actor, if there ever was one, the Great Esquimau Curlew." And he was right, because the Great Esquimau Curlew looked like he might just be coming on stage. His body leaning forward, his neck stretched out, his bill sucked up in the air like he was about to sing or something. The composition was stable, the body right in the center. Sorry, guys. Skip the page. Against a mound of grasses, also in the center. And the only thing that upset all of this was his bill, which he looked at first because it seemed to stick out above the scenery, and it was upside down. "Am I supposed to look like that when I come on stage?" said Lil. But remember, guys, I'm not a chump. I didn't say a thing. On Tuesday and Friday evenings and Saturday afternoons for the rest of May, Mr. Spicer drove Lil and me down to New York City and dropped us off at the Rose Theater, where Mr. Gregory was always standing outside waiting for us and making it look like we were late. On the drive down, Lil went over her Helen Burns lines again, and again, and again, and again. Miss Scatcherd is hasty. You must take care not to offend her. Do you think it's Scatcherd or Scatcherd? She said. It's Scatcherd, I said. And she tried it out. She tried it out again. Scatcherd, she said. And that's pretty much how the whole way down to New York City was. And just so everyone knows, here are the stats. Number of times I repeated Lil's lines with her, let's say something over 6,000. Number of times I had to correct her, let's say something over 6,000. 60,000. Apologies. Number of times we drove down to New York City before I had all her lines down myself, 6. Number of times she asked me to say my lines, 0. Which is probably because she didn't want me shrieking like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years while we were locked inside a car. But I'm not lying. I was a great shrieker. I'd been practicing too. And if you're going to get this right, you can't just shriek, because anyone can do that. To shriek like an insane woman who had been locked in an attic for a great many years, you have to practice. The first time I practiced was in our bathroom, and when Lucas heard it, he tried to roll his wheelchair right up the stairs because he figured that there was a bloody murderer who was at my throat. He got 3 steps up before I heard him. After that, he said I had to practice outside. So I went to the field on the way to Mrs. Windermere's house, and I hoped that no one was around. Here's how you practice if you want to be an insane woman who's been locked up in an attic for a great many years. Number 1, you stand in the middle of the field. Number 2, you look around to make sure that no one is going to hear you. Number 3, you breathe in a couple times to get as much air in your chest as you can. And finally, you stretch up your neck like the great Equimau Curlew. And then you imagine that it's the Game 7 of the World Series, and it's the bottom of the ninth, and the Joe Pepito is rounding third base. And then the throw is coming in, and the catcher has his glove up waiting for the ball, and Joe Pepitone is probably going to be out, and the game will be over, and the Yankees are going to lose. And then you let out your shriek, because that's how everyone in Yankee Stadium will be shrieking right then, too. And that's how you practice shrieking like an insane woman who's been locked in an attic for a great many years. And you keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over again until all the birds in Marysville have flown away. But I'm not lying, I got pretty good at it. If you had heard me shrieking, you would have thought someone had been murdered too. It was eerie. You might have thought that someone had been murdered was shrieking. You might have thought that someone who had been murdered had come back and was murdering the murderer who was shrieking. That's how good I was. But when the cast of Jane Eyre heard me shriek off stage for the first time, they all looked around to see who had done it. And then they started clapping. And that's pretty dang good. Lil said I was a natural. It hardly sounded like acting at all. And how was I doing on? She also wanted to make sure that I was still doing our Transcontinental Railroad of the United States project. Mr. Gregory said I might have to tone it down a little bit since we didn't want people in the first 2 rows fainting away. Mrs. Windermere said I might have to tone it down a bit since we didn't want people in the first 2 rows wetting their pants. It got so that I liked the rehearsals, even though it meant that I couldn't be drawing the great Equimau Curlew with Mr. Powell those Saturday afternoons. But I loved watching Lil on stage. I loved listening to her lines, which, as you might remember, I started to know by heart. It was, for the record, scatchered, and I didn't want to say anything, even after Mr. Gregory had to correct her a couple times, even for a 3rd time. But I loved when Lil looked out onto the seats to see if I was watching her. Which you better believe I always was. In May, Lucas was hired for 3 stupid jobs. You can imagine how that felt. And you can imagine how it felt when he got fired from all 3 stupid jobs. The first time he was hired was at a golf station, and it wasn't his fault. Things started out all right, but then there were these 3 stupid days of stupid rain in a row. And when people drove up to get gas, Lucas would wheel out to the garbage as quickly as he could. He'd come around the door to find out how much gas they wanted, and then he would wheel around the pump and pump it. Then he'd come back around to the door to get the money, then wheel back to the garage to get their change and their genuine crystal goblet, since golf was running a special. But by then, he was pretty drippy. So when Lucas's boss was driving home and he saw one of his old customers at the Sunoco station instead, he stopped and asked him how come he wasn't at his golf station. And that jerk customer told him that he couldn't stand to have a guy with no legs wheel himself in and out of the rain all the time just to pump his gas, so he decided to go to Sunoco station instead. Lucas was fired the very next morning. "We can't be losing our dependable customers," his stupid Xbox said. The second time he was fired was from A&P, when Lucas had to hold on the edge of a display to show some oranges high up, and his stupid edge broke right off his hand. You can imagine what happened to all those oranges. His boss fired him right then and there, with all the oranges still scattered around him. He wouldn't even give him a salary, because who was going to have to pay for all those stupid ruined oranges after all? The third time he was fired was from the bank at Catskills, where Lucas was a teller for a whole 2.5 minutes on a Saturday morning until Mr. Rothke came in and asked for him to deposit 3 checks and to cash the fourth, and he cashed the wrong one, she said. She complained loudly enough that the manager came over, and Lucas explained that he had cashed the one she asked him to cash, and he was already fixing the problem. And Mrs. Rothke said that she wasn't going to be lied about by the likes of him, and she heard what soldiers in Vietnam had done, and he was probably so drug-addled that he couldn't even keep proper directions from anyone. And how was someone like that supposed to be trusted in a bank? And it wasn't a bank's business to take up hard luck cases like him, at least, and not a bank that would care that she would be able to put her money into. Lucas didn't even wait to be fired. He wheeled himself away from the bank. Christopher was supposed to meet with him after work to get him down the stairs out of the front, but Lucas decided he was going to take those stairs for himself. At the bottom, he wouldn't let anyone else help him back into the chair. See, he didn't quite make it all the way down. He told Christopher it took him a half hour to get back up in that chair, but to be honest, it was probably longer than that. I guess he wasn't actually fired from that job. I suppose he quit. I mean, sort of. What do you guys think? When I got back to New York City that night, though, Lucas was alone in the living room watching some John Wayne Western, where John Wayne was riding horses and climbing up fences and walking that way he walks. The television was the only thing in the room, and at first, the commercial, I asked him how things were going. "Swell," he said. And I looked at him, and I asked him again how work was, and he told me. We left all the lights off so that I wouldn't see that he was crying. If Mrs. Rothke had been there at that moment, I would have punched her right in the face. Guys, I don't know about you, but obviously it's pretty disturbing for me to read about all these people being so mean to Lucas. Do they have a point, though? I'm just saying, if you're a business owner and people are leaving because you have a customer who's in a wheelchair, is it okay to fire him? Obviously, in today's world, these types of things, you could never do that. Instantly, these people would be sued, and they would probably lose their business if they tried to fire someone based on a disability. But back in 1969, things were very, very different. But all right, let's get back to it. The play was going to open at the Rose Theater in New York City on the last Friday of May. That week, you might have thought that Lil was blasting off to the moon because she was that nervous. She had stomach aches almost every day. She missed 2 of her advanced algebra assignments, which just so happened never before, not even once. She forgot to read the first act of Our Town, which wasn't missing much, and I'm not lying. And she never even asked how I was doing on our Transcontinental Railroad to the United States project, which if she would have asked, I would have told her was going to get us a Golden Spike Award, which she wouldn't have understood because, as you might remember, there's only one of us who's actually working on the report. During class, she mostly held her stomach and chewed on her pencils. She bit all the erasers off, and she ate them. Then she gnawed on the metal tips until they came off. Then she stared into the wood. There were yellow splinters all around her desk, and Mrs. Verne said it was perfectly normal for an actress. When she played the tragic Jocasta, she had gone through 3 fountain pens. And on that last Friday, Mr. Ferris set Clarence Rocket on that table as soon as the class started. "This is, if I'm not mistaken, the big day," he said. And Lil turned red, then white, then red again. Lil Spicer, what little I know of a biology suggests that neither the gums of the eraser, nor the tin of the metal top, nor the wood of the pencil shaft, nor the lead of the interior will do much for your digestive system. I can't help it. Mr. Ferris went over to her desk. He took the pencil from her hand and examined it. And since there wasn't much left, it wasn't a long examination. Lil Spicer, perhaps during today's experiment, you should allow Doug Switek to handle the more toxic chemicals. At that, Lil nodded. Mr. Ferris went back to the front. A few days ago, Apollo 10 descended to the 8-pound, 4 miles from the lunar surface to practice a moon landing. The astronauts described the Earth as a tiny blue, brown, and white basketball suspended in the void of outer space. They said that the moon is pitted with holes and that it's illuminated clearly by Earth's reflected light. They said that some of the craters seemed to glow softly. He threw the pencil stub in the garbage can. Lil Spicer, you and Doug Switek are doing something extraordinary during a very extraordinary time to be alive. You're the first Washington Irving Junior High School students to ever perform on a Broadway play. As far as I know, you're the first citizens from Marysville to ever perform in a Broadway play. And trust me, there's no need to be nervous. The Apollo missions have already descended close to the moon's surface. And as far as I know, you two have already succeeded too. If you could have seen Lil smile at that moment, if you could have seen her relax into her chair, and if you could have seen my mother in that hat and white gloves when she got into Spicer's car to go see a Broadway play that her son was in, if you could have seen her, We recited Lil's lines together all the way down into New York City that afternoon. And even though she was nervous, she had a stomach ache again, she got every line right, except for Statcherd, of course. We stopped at a White Castle on the way down and ate about 24 hamburgers. Lil gave me her onions, and I scraped the pickles onto her hamburger. But my mother and Mr. and Mrs. Spicer couldn't eat it all, because they were too nervous, they said. Even Elle ate only one, too. At the theater, Mr. Gregory was, of course, waiting for us. He looked pretty nervous, too. He bundled us inside, and we were 2 hours late instead of 2 hours early. He bundled us inside like we were 2 hours late instead of 2 hours early. He sent Lil into the dressing room that she could start becoming Helen Burns. I didn't even have to do anything. If you're off stage, you can shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years without actually having to look like an insane woman who had been locked in an attic for many years. And so I read Our Town. Terrific. While Lil got ready, and my mother and Mr. and Mrs. Spicer went for a walk in Times Square because they couldn't bear to wait in that theater, they said. And besides, my mother had never seen Times Square before. And that is why they were not around when Mr. Gregory came looking for them. They're out for a walk, I said. His face, though, looked like there had been a disaster. What? I said. Mrs. Windermere happened to make her theater appearance right then. Blue dress, flouncing, a couple of 100 strands of pearls draped around her neck, and an ivory cane that she didn't really need. Gregory, this is the night! Mr. Gregory looked at her. What happened? Come with me, he said. What's going on? I said. Oh, everything's fine, said Mrs. Windermere. Sure. They were gone a long time, though, and while I waited to see how everything was fine, I watched the theater fill up more and more, this little hole in the stage wings. Mrs. Windermere said that she had never had a play without a packed house, and it looked like she was going to keep her stats perfect. The rows was filing up quickly, and it wasn't filling up with just anybody either. I'm not lying. Mayor Lindsay came out of the aisle, shaking hands with everyone that could reach him and smiling like a parade or something. And a little after him came Jimmy Stewart. Really, the real-life Jimmy Stewart. Walking, shaking hands too, with those huge hands just like he has. Jimmy Stewart. Which, just so you guys know, Jimmy Stewart, if you guys can recall, is the star from the movie It's a Wonderful Life that we watched earlier this year. He's the one who played the lead character of George Bailey, Jimmy Stewart. But you know what? This was nothing. I saw my mom and Lily's parents come in and sit down a couple on the second row, and then Mr. Gregory going out to see them. And then they all got up and they started heading backstage. I guess to wish me and Lil good luck one more time. And then right near where the seats were, guess who came in and sat down? He just sat down real easy, crossed his legs and leaned back and looked up at the ceiling a couple times, and then turned around to someone and shook hands, and then turned around to someone else and took his program and signed it. Do you know who was there to see us? Joe Pepitone. I'm not lying. Joe Pepitone was sitting in the second row of a Rose Theater. Joe Pepitone. And you know what I'm going to do? I was going to shriek like an insane woman who had been locked in an attic for a great many years. In front of Joe Pepitone. You know what that feels like? You can't know what it feels like because you've never had to shriek like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years in front of the Joe Pepitone. Oh my gosh, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. Not in front of Joe Pepitone. I looked through the little hole in the stage wings. Again, he was reading his program. He was probably getting to the part where it said voice of Bertha Mason, Douglas Swiatek. Any second now he was going to lean over to someone near him and say, isn't that a guy's name? And he was going to say, how can a guy play the voice of Bertha Mason? Then he was going to look at my name again and say, you know what? That name sounds familiar. And then he was going to think about it some more and he would say, that name's so familiar. And then after a long time, he was going to remember. He was going to remember our game of catch from last summer. Terrific. I looked around wildly. And suddenly, there was my mother and Mr. and Mrs. Spicer and Mr. Gregory and Mrs. Windermere and Lil, who was taking her turn looking like a disaster. We've got to get out there, I said. Mr. Spicer nodded. We know, but we're going to have to take her to the hospital right away. Her? Wait, hospital? Yeah, we think it might be the pencils, said Mrs. Spicer. Lil smiled, sort of. She was holding on to her parents pretty tight, but she was crying. Break a leg, she said, but she was still crying. Break a leg, I said. Yeah, that's what they say to actors before they go on stage, said Mr. Gregory. Wait, on stage? Lil tried to smile again. Remember, Doug, it's sketch heard. I shook my head. Wait, I'm not going on stage. My mother put on her hands on her face. Mrs. Windermere came and stood beside me. She put one hand on my shoulder and then the other one. Who else knows all the lines of Helen Burns? She said. And I looked at her, and I looked at Mr. Gregory, and I looked back at my mother, then at Mr. and Mrs. Spicer, then I looked at Lil. Break a leg, she said. Now she said it, though, sort of weak. He'll be fine. No, I won't, I said. We've got to get you to the dressing room. No, I said. You remember who's sitting in the audience? Do you remember who's sitting in the second row? Do you know the lines or not? Said Mr. Gregory. No, I don't, I said. He's lying, said Lil. If we were to just tie his hair up into a bun? No way, I am not doing that in front of Joe Pepitone. And maybe give him some baby powder on his face, maybe make him look pale. Baby powder? Did you know that Joe Pepitone is sitting out there? I yelled out. Yes, there's a great many people sitting out there, said Mr. Gregory. Lil grimaced, but not because of Joe Pepitone. I think we'd better go. The Spicers left, and Lil's stomach was hurting badly at that point, and she didn't even look back. Mr. Gregory and Mr. Windermere looked at me in the dressing room. Well, this is what we have to work with. They said to do a whole lot of people who began to smile at me a whole lot, and they weren't the kind of people that make you happy. Listen, if this just because of some stomach ache, I said. Remember, Mrs. Windermere said, people were starting to tie my hair up in a bun. Jane Eyre will walk on stage and address you. You'll be reading a book on a bench. Jane won't speak to you until you turn the page, so don't forget to turn it. Then she'll say, is your book interesting? And you'll say, wait a minute, skinny delivery boy, listen here. What will you say? I'll say, nope, it stinks. Doug, said Mrs. Windermere. I say I like it, and she'll say, what's it about? And I'll hand it to her. You may look at it, I'll say. By this time, my hair was tied up in a bun, a tight bun, and someone was powdering the back of my neck. Could you go out there and tell Joe Pepitone to go home, please? I said. And when she says, do you like the teachers here at Lowell Institution, you'll say, I'm going to say that they stink too. Mrs. Winter looked at me at this moment hard. I'm going to say they're all criminally insane. I think Mr. Gregory was about to start crying right there, even though it wasn't him that was getting his hair tied up in a bun, which, by the way, hurts if you're wondering. You have to get this right, Mr. Gregory said. Sorry. And I said that it was the have to get me gave the great idea, even as someone told me to raise my arms so that she could slip a long Lowood Institution dress over me, which didn't exactly help with my bun look. Mr. Windermere, I know the part, but this changes things. What do you mean? I mean, Lil and I were going to get to Snow a Heron for this, right? She nodded, a little suspicious. But if I'm going to play Helen Burns in front of Joe Pepitone, I want that red-throated diver, too. Mrs. Windermere opened her eyes wide, and I mean really wide. I've had those divers in my house for years, she said. I waited. That wasn't part of our agreement. I waited again. They're perfect over my mantle. Yeah, but they're also perfect back in the book, I said. And she shook her head. Oh, absolutely not. Do you realize how much that plate cost me? I waited some more. Agreed, said Mr. Gregory, and he shook my hand. And there it was. Mrs. Minderwehr looked at me in the same way an insane woman might look when she'd been locked in an attic for many great years, would have looked at him. It's not your decision, Gregory. It's my theater, it's my production, it's my reputation, and it's my money, said Mr. Gregory. He held his hand and he shook it again. I could use a bowl of lemon ice cream, said Mrs. Windermere. But I'm not lying. I was killer as Helen Burns. I stepped out onto that stage like I was a great Esquimalt Carew. And when Jane Eyre came to look at my book, which so happened to be Our Town, I handed it right to her. And when Mrs. Scatcherd told me I never cleaned my nails, I was about as quiet and innocent as a large-billed puffin. And when she hit me a couple dozen times with a bunch of twigs, I was that brown pelican, and I didn't bat an eye. And you were trying to get hit a dozen times with a bunch of twigs, and when I had to die, people were really crying, really. And you know why? Because I was that blackback gull at that moment. And so people cried like Helen Burns was their best friend. Maybe even Joe Pepito was crying too. Who knows? And Mr. Gregory was crying too, probably in relief. You should have heard the clapping as the curtain came down on dead Helen Burns. When I got to the wings, Mr. Gregory picked me up and hugged me and twirled me around and got the baby powder all over himself, and I had to tell him to let me go since I had to head back to the dressing room because I wasn't going to be Helen Burns any longer than I had to, and someone was going to help me get this stupid bun untied. By the way, you can guess what my mother was doing in the wings, but the best part was still to come. Maybe it was because the Helen Burns applause, or maybe it was all the practice, or maybe it was because Joe Pepitone was in the second row. But I let out that Bertha Mason shriek, and by the time that first echoes finished bouncing back from the mezzanine, I wasn't the only one in the Rose Theater who was shrieking. It was that good. I bet that everyone there did think that there was an insane woman who had been locked up in their attic in a theater for a great many years. And I bet they all believed that's what they just heard her. I guess the rest of the play was all right. I spent some of it reading Our Town and some of it working on the Transcontinental Railroad of the United States report, which was almost finished, even though a certain someone hadn't written a single word, and now she wasn't probably going to say that she was so sick she couldn't write anything else either. Terrific. But I'm not lying. When I was thinking about was a certain book and certain missing pages and bringing those pages back to a certain library and handing them to a certain librarian and me and Lil watching as he put those back into the book. I know what the red-throated divers are watching for, and I know what the next spectacular thing is. By the time we got to Reader, I married him. A quiet wedding we had. He and I, the parson and clerk, were a lone part. It was 11 o'clock, and Mrs. Windermere still had to drive my mother and me back home, which meant it would be almost 1 a.m. before I could get to sleep. But I didn't care, because I'd finished laying that last Continental rail and pounded in the golden spike, and the audience was standing and hollering, and the next day I'd be handing 2 Audubon prints to Mr. Powell. What could be better? Who cares if Mrs. Windermere was taking forever being a playwright out in the lobby? Who cares if she was holding my mother beside her like they were new best friends? What could be better? And about then, Joe Pepitone came backstage. He really did, I mean it. Joe Pepitone backstage. Hey, kid, he said. I looked at him. Joe Pepitone. Doug, right? I nodded. At Joe Pepitone, guys. Did I throw with you last fall? You still got my cap? I nodded. This was Joe Pepitone, guys. He laughed. I laughed that only Joe Pepitone could laugh. I saw your name in the program. So you were the guy who shrieked off stage? I nodded. You know, kid, you almost made me wet my pants. I laughed, and he laughed, and I tried to laugh like him. And you were Helen Burns, too, weren't you? My heart stopped. Do you know what it means when your heart stops? It means that when you think that nothing could be better right then and there and then, it all falls apart. If you remember, I told you that a long time ago. I nodded. Yup, I said. He shook his head, big smile. You were great. You had me bawling. Even though I knew that it was you, bawling kid. Man, I wish I had your talent. You had that whole house tonight all by your fingers. Then he held out his program. No, I already got one, I said. It's not for you, kid, it's for me. I want you to sign it for me. He opened it up to where my name was. Right there, he said, and he handed me a pen inside his pocket like he had put it there on purpose so I could sign a program for him. And then I signed it, for Joe Pepitone. And write something for Horace, too, he said. And so I did. Here's what I wrote. For Joe and Horace, thanks. Your friend, Doug. Joe Pepitone took the program back out for it. Thanks for what, he said. For everything, I said. Mrs. Windermere drove us back home really late, but you might say that we were both more than a little happy because now Mr. Gregory had called Jane Eyre a smash hit and told us it was going to have a long run, and so Mrs. Windermere was flying high. I was too, but mostly because Mr. Gregory had promised that if I stayed as an understudy, he would find another actor/actress to play Helen Burns until Lil came back, which was fine by me. And you know what Mr. Gregory had given me and was now rolled up in a long tube in the back of the car? You know what he gave me. My mother, Mrs. Windermere, and I sang about living in a yellow submarine the whole way back, through Manhattan, across the Whitestones, and all the way up to Marysville. Sometimes when you keep singing the same song again and again, it gets really boring, really, really boring. But not on that drive for us, because it just got funnier and funnier. So we finally had to stop singing around Middleton because I thought that Mrs. Windermere was going to drive off the road. That's how hard she was laughing. And my mother was about crying. When we got back home, all the lights were on in the living room, and we opened the door, and that's when Lucas and Christopher were there, sitting and looking at us. How'd it go? Christopher said. Fabulous. And I told them all about Joe Pepitone. I told them about shrieking, and I told them about having to play Helen Burns, which I hadn't intended to tell them. We know all about Helen Burns, said Lucas. How? I said. Lucas looked down. Mrs. Spicer called a while ago, said Christopher. He called from a hospital in New York City. Did she tell you that Lil got stomachache from eating all those pencils? I said. My mother took my hand. Little brother, Lil doesn't have a stomachache. And at that moment, the yellow shank finally walked into the full darkness. If you guys didn't catch it, something bad is about to happen to Lil. And I'm going to kind of leave us there. So if it went over your head, I'm just going to let you guys know that. Lil has something bad. If it's not a stomachache, it's something else here. I'm assuming a lot of us are going to want to go right into the final chapter with the way this is left here. I think this is definitely my favorite chapter of the book. This is, it's a fun chapter. A lot of stuff. Obviously, Doug gets to meet Joe. Did you notice who didn't go to the play? His dad did not attend. His mom went alone. I think this chapter does a lot for the self-confidence of our main character, Doug, especially when all his teachers were really going crazy over him and Lil. They were really giving him support. His mom was giving him support. And the best thing of all, he got the support of his hero, Joe Pepitone, which I think is awesome. But the question is, what's wrong with Lil? As we know, this book is called Okay for Now, and things were the most okay that Doug's ever had in his entire life. So it does seem kind of fitting that right when things are the best of Doug's life, maybe something's going to come crashing down. We've got one chapter left, guys. I'm going to read it hopefully tomorrow, and I'll be on very shortly for you. But everybody else, take care and stay safe. Bye, guys.